Hello guys, Max from HighOnAndroid. Today I'm going to start a new series called Ask Max. So today's going to be number one. I'm going to try to do these once a day. I might not make a video every day, but whenever I can I'll make a video. But I already did it, the writing, so I'm probably going to just post it on my site at HighOnAndroid. Today is, why don't you use Apple? This is a question by Armadillo Tech Pro Max. All right, my friend who sells cases. So let me go ahead and start with why I don't use Apple. It actually goes back to 1989. That's when I first got my first computer. All right, I encountered my first encounter with a computer back in 1986. I think that was like an Apple II or something, but I remember I went over to my friend's house and we were using these floppy disks, and he would put a bunch of code that he found on the computer magazine, and he would actually be able to make that code into a game. And that became like the first time I encountered a computer, and I was like, oh wow, you could code and make your own games. And I became really interested in computers. And eventually, somehow I immigrated from South Korea when I was 9 to America, California, 1989. And I attended a computer show because there was, I guess, a lot of computer shows in America, in California back then. So I attended that, and I never imagined my dad would buy me a computer. But that day, my dad wrote a check for $3,000 for a 386 DX 25 megahertz. All right, I could have gotten a Mac back then. They actually had a graphical GUI. You know, it was like one of the earlier Macs. And the reason why I didn't get a Mac, I did a bunch of research, of course, before I bought it. And the main reason was there was less games. Like back then, amount of programs you could get for Mac was like probably like something like 10, 20, 30 times less than on PCs. Now PCs were also much cheaper. At the computer show, I saw like literally 300 different companies selling IBM compatibles. There was so much competition. All these companies were small companies building their own computer and selling them at the computer show. So I ended up getting one of these small companies' computers, and that was like, you know, when even as a kid, I knew I wanted to get something that was valuable and something that was very open. Right, so it all started when I was 9 years old. I never really liked Macs or Apple. Ever since then, I just, you know, wasn't really interested in overpriced tech with minimal selection of software. Of course, Apple has gotten a lot better with iPhone days, and now they have a ton of apps and stuff. But back then, the software selection was very small for Macs. That was one of the main reasons I did not go with Macs. So that's how I got started with computers. Sort of got into, sorry, there's a bee here. It's a yellow jacket. So that's how I got into computers. Forward, he likes my foot. Maybe I just took a shower. So forward 10 years. So I went to college in 18. I think when I was 20, I majored in computer engineering, and one of the classes you had to take was called Minix, learning about the operating system, obviously. So Minix is, I think Andrew Tannenbaum was his name. Basically, he took Unix and broke it down into simpler educational OS operating system. So if you guys in college, should take that course, or you know, you could just Google it and learn it about it. But it's an excellent way. Now, Linus Torvalds also took that same exact class, but he took Minix and modified it a little bit and made it into a open source, 100% free operating system. that any company, any individual could use and make something better. Right? So that's why that was a really, that's when I learned about Linux. Linux was just getting started back then, and I learned about Linus Torvalds and how he was giving this software for free. All right, and ever since then I became really interested in Linux, and I told myself when I graduate from college, I want to work in a company that builds mobile Linux systems, because I knew back then, desktop computers are boring, but I knew I had certain idea that some kind of embedded computers, like let's say everything has a computer nowadays. Your rice cooker, your fridge, all of those have an embedded computer, microcomputer. So I wanted to work in an area of embedded computers. So that was my dream, and eventually I got a job selling computer chips in Korea. It wasn't exactly embedded Linux, but we were selling these computer chips that were easy to, it was embedded chips you could use to make industrial machines. So while I was working there, I started blogging and stuff. Anyway, fast forward another 6 years after my college days, and somehow I became like a blogger, YouTuber, whatever, when YouTube first started out. So I started making videos about smartphone or technology in general, and that's when a lot of iPhone came out, right? And I wasn't really interested. I was like, Apple, closed source, what's that gonna do? It's just gonna make Apple more rich. Because I was just an avid fan of open source. I hate any company that's really just purely for greed and profit. That's, to me, Apple's just pure greed and profit for me. All right, I don't respect Steve Jobs in any way. I respect Linus Torvalds. Linus Torvalds revolutionized the open source world. You guys know Teslas use Linux. Tesla Auto Drive runs on Linux. All right, Android is a fork of Linux. It still runs on top of Linux kernel. It is basically a Linux machine. All right, there's a ton of things. Over maybe 60% of the web servers in the whole world uses Linux because it's free. A lot of gambling machines, if you go to casinos, all those new electronic machines use Linux. You know why? No licensing fees. So these companies are able to develop things using open source. There's a lot of things like cashier POS machines at grocery stores. A lot of them now use Linux. You don't know, but Linux is actually being used like pretty much everywhere. Now, that's because it's open source. Now think about Apple. Is Apple being used on a Tesla? No. Is Apple being used at groceries, at POS? No. Is Apple being used for web servers? You could, but why would you want to? The cost efficiency would just, be whacked. Like, nobody uses Apple to run their web servers. So having it open source cuts down the licensing fees. And another beauty of open source is that people can collaborate. So Linus Torvalds was already collaborating with other engineers from all over the world and making Linux better. And this is still going on. And this started a whole new boom of open source. All right? We'll talk about Bitcoin another time, but Bitcoin is also open source. Bitcoin came from Linux in an indirect way. Without Linux just taking off and setting an example for the world, none of this Bitcoin, all this other stuff, Tesla, would be here today, including Android. That's why I've been a huge fan of it. I'm sorry, I got lost there. So when Palm Pre came out in 2010, it ran pretty much Linux. It wasn't even like a fork version like Android. It actually ran pure Linux. I wrote tutorials on my YouTube channel on how to run web servers on your Palm Pre and a bunch of different hacks. And I love that. But Palm Pre died because they ran out of money. They had this technology way ahead of its time. Their web OS, I think the GUI was just really, really smooth. I think their just marketing team sucked. They weren't able to get the ball rolling, and they folded after only a year because they ran out of money. Palm had its problems with other products also, so it got sold to LG, and it got sold, and that's what killed him. All right, because once it got sold, nobody cared, and they just sliced it up. But if had Palm Pre with WebOS would have been around till now, I bet it would have been better than Android. I actually like it more Android. So I didn't have a choice to keep going with Palm because they went out of business after a year. And that's when I saw Android as an alternative, the next alternative. And that's like right after Google bought Android. And I never used the G1. My first phone was actually the Nexus 1. In January 2011, I was flying to CES, to Vegas, and my Nexus 1 had arrived in my house, so I had to wait a whole week until I got back to my house to use my Nexus 1. And that's when I first created my site, obviously my brand, HighOnAndroid, because I believe that this Android would change the world. And back then, less than 0.001% used Android when Nexus 1 came out. Today's numbers, over 50% of the whole world uses Android as a smartphone. Way more than Apple iPhone these days. Cheers to that.